Hi, I'm Nick Vitchev, Research Director, Financial Crime and Compliance at Chartis. I have the great pleasure of being joined by Ted Datta, Senior Director, Head of Financial Crime Compliance Practice for Europe, Africa, and Americas at Moody's. Hi, Ted.
Hi, Nick. Nice to see you.
We're talking about a very fascinating and very topical subject today, notably the use of shell companies to conduct illicit activities, money laundering, etc. So this is something that's been in the news a lot, something that's on everyone's mind at the moment, and it's emerged as a really prominent way of facilitating money laundering. Why do you think shell companies and the use of shell companies is such a threat?
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me on. I think it's a great question. And to give it justice, I think what we're seeing with shell companies, why it's resonating so much in the market is it's something that really intersects the full range of illicit activity and financial crimes that the market's concerned about. And it's both relevant in Europe as it is in the US and here in the UK. And it's also driven by world events. I'll give you some examples. So let's take sanctions. 24th of February, Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago. On the 7th of March, just 2 weeks after that, US authorities, FinCEN, issued a sanctions evasion notice with 7 red flags to look out for. The first 2 of those 7 red flags refer to corporate vehicles. The second one refers to the use of shell companies. So within 14 days of that event taking place, the authorities are putting the industry on a new notice that shell companies are something which can be used to help institutes evade and circumvent sanctions. Just last week, we're still in the same dynamic, unfortunately, in terms of world events. The US authority, OFAC, issued some more designations, and the description of that program, under which they gave names and designated new sanction targets, was sanctions evasion, circumvention, and backfill. So they're continuing to target the same type of activity, organizations circumventing, evading, using trading routes, using shell companies to obfuscate trade, make it difficult to track the distribution channel and the end user. So from a sanctions lens, that really has been one of the key reasons why shell companies have been such a threat, are perceived such a new threat, and something people are really taking notice of because of the reporting obligations around potentially facilitating a breach of sanctions evasion, and because of the macro factors and the risk events and the narrative that's overtaken a lot of financial crime since Russia invaded Ukraine on 24th of February. So you've got the sanctions context of one, that's global but driven in the US. Here in the UK, we've had, in the post-COVID era, a lot of focus on fraud. So fraud, our UK government determined to be a national security threat akin to terrorism. 40% of all crime in the UK is fraud. 39% of that crime is social engineering, which is various types of typologies, romance scams being quite high profile. Many of the firms involved in those romance scams have been linked to fake companies, tied here to the UK registry with links to higher risk jurisdictions. There's some articles referenced about particularly a romance scam typology called pig butchering, where the victim is hooked, manipulated, and these things have heartbreaking and life-changing consequences for the victim. And at the root of a lot of that financial crime and fraud activity is the use of shell companies that create fake assets, invoices, addressed, create the fake feel of legitimacy that are then used to facilitate the transaction. So that again has had a huge amount of focus. The UK has a new failure to prevent fraud offence in the Economic Crime and Transparency Act, and it's really interesting to see how that will manifest in terms of entities creating and being involved in the use of shell companies. And finally, the EU. So serious organised crime, money laundering continues to be, let's say, big business in the EU, if you can avoid the turn of phrase. 80% of criminal networks in the EU are misusing legal business structures. That's not my words, that's words of Europol from their serious organised crime report last year. So they're using the legal business environment to facilitate criminal activities. Last week or week before last, the EU finalised the text of a new AML regulation. This is a generational shift in the way that money laundering will be controlled and enforced in the EU. And buried in Annex 3 of that text are a new consideration for high risk factors. These are risk factors that when you're doing customer risk assessment, you need to think about. And for the first time, we see the EU in that regulation referring to shell companies. So the text itself, I'll read you the specifics if I can dig it out. So part of the risk assessment now to consider for all obliged entities, so banks, real estate firms, gambling, gaming, casinos, they've got to consider if the legal entity or arrangement is created or established in a jurisdiction in which it has no real economic activity, substantial economic presence, or apparent economic rationale. So there are some of the definitions of shell companies. So we're seeing that both in terms of sanctions evasion in the US, we're seeing it here in the UK in a fraud context, and we're also seeing it right across the EU in terms of money laundering and serious organised crime.
Yes, it's a huge and growing threat, and technology is going to ensure that that threat is going to accelerate, if anything. So that brings me on to the second question, which is why is the threat from shell companies so hard to detect?
Yeah, I think you've got to sort of again take a step back and think around. So when you have any kind of environment to detect, enforce, prevent, you need three things operating in a kind of harmony. You need definitions. So you need to have some standards and definitions of what something is. You need then a regulatory context, right, which can enforce against those standards and definitions through supervisory enforcement agents. And then you need gatekeepers. So we'll talk about those three, and that's really the external environment. That's why it's hard to detect, because there's not a full alignment in those areas. There are emerging things, but we could dig into those. And then there's the internal detection, which really, again, we talk about the obliged entities, the banks, the financial services firms trying to detect. In terms of external, so we have some standards and definitions of shell. The FATF, the Financial Action Task Force in 2018 produced a really interesting report, and they started to talk about shell companies and shelf companies and front companies as slightly distinct flavors of the same risk. Ultimately, is the business legitimate? Is it being used for fake activities, or sorry, is it a fake company being used for legitimate activities? So shell, shelf, and front, first referenced in FATF. FinCEN in the US put some similar text around shelf and shell companies only last year. So we do have some definitions. They're not fully harmonized, but they are emerging as to what a shell company is. So no economic rationale, purpose not akin to its business relationship or business nature, often no physical presence, but these things are quite still embryonic in terms of having definitions at a legal level in terms of shell companies. In terms of regs, then, yes, there are things emerging. I spoke earlier to the UK Economic Crime and Transparency Act, the EU new AML regulation. They do have references in terms of shell companies as high risk. The UK is talking about failure to prevent fraud offence. The UK is also putting on more emphasis on our company house register to verify the data. That's again a large issue in terms of detection, or almost the prevention of shell companies entering the ecosystem. So not all formation agents and not all formation regimes are harmonized. There's not a set of standards as to what the definition of having a verified entity or verified creation of a company. It's different across Europe. The UK has been quite open. In fact, many think it's been too open and has been abused. So the government is putting in new reforms to bring verification. So we are seeing some creation of standards and regulations. Where I think the biggest vulnerability still exists are the gatekeepers. Okay, so those entities who are protecting, creating companies, serving the wider economic environment, but there's vulnerabilities there and they are being exploited. And then just in terms of internal detection, and we'll talk, I guess, more about the policy and process piece, but what we've seen is a trend towards quicker, faster, straight through process. Right? So the banks, the fintechs in this kind of duopoly of thinking about, okay, who am I competing with? Who's my new target audience? What services do I need to offer? Who are my new customers? Then frictionless, easy to onboard, has been something that's been widely used and widely marketed and promoted as a service to use some of the neobanks and digital banks. That doesn't naturally lend itself to the type of investigative need set to identify a shell company. And it's emerging and it's new. Many of those teams who do that are often a bit too far downstream of the process, right? So the sanctions team, the fraud team are often screening or investigating things that had already happened in the organization. So there does need to be a bit of a reset on the skill sets and what to look for in the first line of defense, whether it's then the second line who does and picks up the investigation, but certainly balancing what I would say would be a straight through process, but also with this idea of targeted friction. And we do hear that now more from our customers, is you want to create some targeted friction in the process where they believe they've got vulnerabilities, because financial crime risks are significant and fraud risks are significant. So both those things carry a monetary and a reputational concern for the marketplace.
Yes, absolutely. And the targeted friction piece is something that we're hearing all the time. And in fact, tying risk processes closer to that, end user journey is key to a lot of organizations' sort of plans. So, final question really is, given that context, that complexity, what can be done about it at a sort of practical level?
Yeah, I think the people side is always first. So you have to create an awareness. So what we do here is we tell stories. We take the data, we tell a story. With our shell company data story, we told a story that the world really wanted to know, which created a huge amount of resonance in the industry. Things that we've spotted. So individuals who are at the ripe old age of over 900 are directors of companies. So you can immediately get a very emotive connection. That doesn't seem right. That just doesn't seem to make sense. So telling stories at the one level of to create an awareness and humanize the problem. Then telling stories around real cases. So I mentioned before the UK issue around romance scams, around fake companies, crypto scams. That was all in the public domain by reputable news outlets. And then you can link that to real life examples of shell companies. So the spoof companies, the companies that are pretending to be part of a global technology business that really are not anything to do with that, using a fake name and a similar name. So again, it's really emotive, but it creates an understanding that's beyond just the typical financial crime compliance personas into the wider organizations that the compliance team's looking to influence. Sanctions also, right? The narrative around sanctions is incredibly compelling for people to lean into. And if you can think about, right, there's an evasion risk, look, these shell companies, it's not your classic screening. We'll get onto the kind of technology challenge, but you've got to think slightly tangentially or around the networks. So training, internal education, making it human is one massive aspect of it. Then there is understanding the typologies. So the work that Moody's has been doing to put out there is a set of 7 risk flags to really understand those typologies and what do they mean for you. So, what does mass registration actually mean? It means companies coming and going, or certainly appearing and then maybe disappearing and maybe being used for some kind of financial crime activity, something nefarious. So linking these typologies to the risk, again, bringing it back to the top level human story of this is a fraud event. In this fraud event, someone unfortunately lost their entire life savings. So I think the humanization is really important. Then the typologies, and then the detection process piece. So I think when you look at most of the larger organizations that we serve, the KYC process, certainly, we have these 3 lines of defense model, right? And it oscillates how people deploy that. But what you find is that with these new emerging threats, the traditional tooling isn't appropriate. So just screening names on lists and looking to collect information from registries is very limited. So you get a kind of quite limited view of the corporate entity from the local registry. You put some names into a list and you find out if that person matches, hopefully if it matches using your technology. That's the case of many people, large and small, doing some level of KYC. you do have downstream investigative tools, insights, and there's been an emergence. And I think that second line in the transaction monitoring world has been quite well served with machine learning and insights. But I don't think necessarily the same set of stakeholders in the first line or in that onboarding workflow has been as well served with insights. So we're still effectively, in many cases, using similar sets of technologies, right, in terms of lists that we're screening, that we've been screening for 20 plus years in the industry. And the detection rates kind of, we get incremental gains through machine learning for sure. But in terms of that risk journey, I think there's certainly an underserved market where Moody's is investing, is taking the raw data and delivering insights that only a large comprehensive data set with some subject matter expertise on top can really help to distill down to a first line, second line investigator. So we see an appetite in that kind of journey of the onboarding for, I've got 30 minutes, surface that risk quickly, and then give me a decision to make. Do I escalate that for a complex investigation, or do I offboard at that point? So we think there is an emerging a need there, and those teams need the insights. They need network investigation capabilities, and they need those tools to be in their workflow. So that's really where we are, where we're thinking and where we're heading.
Thank you. I gather we're on time, so really appreciate your insight and knowledge on this, and thank you so much for the conversation.
Pleasure, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you.